item 9B, our wind energy conversion system ordinance. Keith, you're up.
If I could, Madam Chair, before I bore everybody to death, I would like to turn this over to Sarah Mills with look here, PhD at the University of Michigan, and she has presented to the Michigan Township Association here in Shiawassee County in the past, has offered to come and share information directly with the Planning Commission as we continue to deal with language amendments and potentially a proposal for a wind turbine development. I will say to the audience that we've asked her here as our guest to provide some information to the Planning Commission. Any questions should definitely still be directed to the chair so that we can make sure we can manage and control the meeting. I believe we said about 20-25 minutes. Okay.
Thank you for being here. Sarah, you're up.
Thank you. So I'm, as Pete mentioned, I'm at the University of Michigan in our Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. I put a "Why am I here" slide here because usually University of Michigan isn't doing extension work, right? That's what Michigan State folks do. I have a grant from the CS Mott Foundation, which is out of Flint, to help me take the research that I've gathered from Michigan wind farms over the last 6 years of researching them, and bring them back to the community to actually do more extension work so I'm not just writing for other academics. With the goal of trying to make sure that wind development respects local community values. Really what this is aiming to do is provide you with some data-based accounts of opinions. And so you'll see that I'm really based on survey research. What I'll cover, and yes, absolutely.
Could you move your stuff just a little bit?
So that you can see?
Both of us can see.
Got it, sorry. And if you can't see the screen, there are slides up here as well, so I'll just be going along. But what I plan to present is talking about these surveys of landowners that I've done. First, explaining who was surveyed, and then what they said about the individual level impacts of wind turbines, community level impacts, and then what I've considered to be general recommendations. I will tell you that I've looked quickly through the ordinance that you have before you. I'm not going to comment on specific aspects of it, but what I thought I would do is just provide a little bit of general recommendations about what I've seen are things that I would consider if I were in your shoes. And for what it's worth, I am a planning commissioner in the city of Ann Arbor, so I do sit in your shoes for very different kinds of issues. Okay, so this is survey data. This data is mostly drawn from a 2016, what I call my community survey. This went out to owners of land that was assessed agricultural or residential in 10 townships with wind farms in Michigan. And you can see those townships on the map. If you can't see the map, there's one township in the UP with a wind farm. There's two townships, one's in Missaukee County, one's in Osceola County, very near McBain project. And then there's 7 townships in Huron County in the tip of the thumb. So this went out to all of the owners of those types of properties there. That was about 3,800 people who got the survey. I heard back from just over 2,000, so that's a 53% response rate. And again, that survey itself is funded by the CS Mott Foundation. I'll present the data, but if you're interested in the actual questions, I have the survey on the website, which is the very last slide. There are a couple slides, though, that are drawn from an earlier survey, and this is in 2014, that I call my Farmland Survey. So this went out to owners, all owners of land that's assessed agricultural in 14 townships. 9 of them are some of the same townships that I did that subsequent 2016 survey in. I didn't have the UP at that point. But I also sent it out to 5 townships, those are in the lighter blue, that are as close as I could get to those wind farm projects, but where you couldn't see turbines at that time and there wasn't any wind development. So to try to figure out what attitudes are in a place with similar agricultural characteristics, but that hasn't been exposed to wind development. That survey, because I was just going out to people with ag land, there were fewer people overall that I sent the survey to. It was about 1,700, 1,800, it's been a bit 2014 since I did that. But anyway, I heard back from 1,200 people. That was 72% of those who I sent it to. I got such a high response rate because I sent it out in February, and if people didn't respond the first time around, I sent them another thing in the mail. But farmers like to respond in February. And that one was funded by a Dow Fellowship, which is just an internal U of M thing, just so you know. So my surveys really ask a range of questions, but about what people think about wind energy. And overall, there are a couple of things that predict how people feel, whether or not they're paid. And that's what I'm going to talk a lot about today, because I know that that's something that often gets brought up, and so I've broken down all of my data based on that. But attitudes also depend on what kind of land you own. So generally I found that if you own farmland, you tend to be more accepting of wind energy than people who own just a home, their primary residence in that community. And those people tend to be more accepting of wind than those people who own a secondary home or a vacation home. I don't know what the prevalence of that is around here, but in the UP, I mean, the Garden Peninsula is right along Lake Michigan, and so there's a lot of people that just have secondary homes, and even in the Thumb too, some of those townships have lake frontage. Being within earshot of a turbine, being able to hear it changes your opinion of how you feel about wind energy. Those people who can hear it are less excited about wind. Also important to how people feel is their attitudes about the process of planning for that wind farm and their attitudes about the wind developer themselves, whether they feel like that wind developer acted openly and transparently. All right, so individual level impacts. What do people think? So you can see on the left the things I'm going to go through. First, noise. So I'm going to walk you through this one, and I'll go through the rest really much more quickly, I promise. So on the survey, I pose statements that people can strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with. And this one is, wind turbines create noise pollution. On the left-hand bar, you'll see all of the respondents to the survey. This is that 2016 survey. And so above the line in the bluish colors, it's not turning up so well here, you can see 48% agree that wind turbines create noise pollution. 52% of the respondents disagreed with that. Now, again, on the right-hand side, I just took that exact same data and broke it down based on whether the respondent told me that they were getting a check in the mail from the wind developer or not. And here you can see, as you might expect, that those who are paid are less likely to agree that turbines create noise pollution than those who are unpaid. But what I want to draw your attention to is that it's not completely a haves and have-nots story. That even if you're paid, there are 34% who say turbines are noisy. And they'll tell you, yeah, we can hear the turbines, they're not silent. But also, among people who aren't paid, I'll go on the bottom side, 48% say they disagree that turbines are noisy. So this is not entirely split communities where people have very, very different opinions based on whether or not they're paid or not. There's still lots of shades of gray, even among those different groups. The same thing happens on visual impacts. So here, overall, you can see attitudes are split pretty 50-50. 49% say they agree that turbines create aesthetic problems. 51% say that they don't. Here my numbers do add up to 100. If they don't, there's a couple where that's 99 or 101, and that's just a rounding error from 0.5s. So I wanted to point that out. Again, though, differences between paid and unpaid. People who are paid are less likely to say they cause visual problems than those who are unpaid, but there are still split opinions in both categories. I'll tell you that people on the survey, I leave the entire back of my survey blank so that people can write me comments. And people don't talk to me so much about the look of the turbines during the day. What people tend to be bothered by is the blinking red light at night. Because you can see that red light from a lot farther away, and you're not supposed to be able to block it out of your view than you can see the actual turbine itself. So most people in these communities, at least, aren't worried about what it looks like during the day. They're worried about at night. The next statement that I posed was turbines cause human health problems. Again, here we have 27% of people who live in Michigan communities with wind farms agree with that statement. The balance, so 72% here, disagree with that statement. You could say anybody who says it causes human health problems is a problem. But in terms of what people are telling me, that's what they're saying. Turbines decrease nearby property values. That's something else we might hear. In communities with wind farms, 54% agree that wind turbines reduce nearby property values. 46% disagree. There's differences between those that are paid or unpaid. I'm going to start to say something here and then I'll get to it. The people in the paid category tend to own farmland. And not just a residential property. There are more people in that unpaid category who own residential property. A lot of the research that's been done on impacts on property values has been on impacts on residential property, and the research that I'm not an expert in, but I can point you to some places, says that it can reduce property values. There hasn't been research on the impact on farmland, on the value of farmland. There was something out of Bridge Magazine, in interest of time, I'm just going to stick to my research, that if you can ask me about Bridge Magazine, if not. Anyway, one of the things that I asked is about what impact the wind development has on farm incomes. And I've switched this slide here to go the other way to remind me to tell you this is from my 2014 survey just of owners of farmland. And remember, I sent this survey also to people in communities that didn't have a wind turbine. So their data is above that red line, or above that blue line, I guess. That's the non-wind farm communities. And so I asked them how much they had invested over the last 5 years in a range of categories: their home, outbuildings, drainage, irrigation, and equipment. And they, on average, told me $187,000. In communities with wind turbines, so this is below the line, those people who are unpaid neighbors, so those people who own farmland but aren't getting any check from the wind developer, invested $180,000 in their property. So a little bit less, but in terms of statistics, it's not statistically significant. Neighbors in the pool. These are people who have, who originally said that they would be willing to have a turbine on their property, and they didn't get picked. Their property didn't get picked. Some wind developers will continue to pay them royalties. That's the percentage of profits that are the percentage of the profits that you get from selling that wind energy back to the grid. So these people don't have turbines on their property, but they are getting a check from the wind developer. They told me that they invest $193,000. So again, it's not any different than those in the non-wind farm communities. People with turbines on their property said that they invested twice as much, $449,000. Something that this graph doesn't show is that those people with turbines on their property have larger farms than some of their neighbors. And so even when you control for the fact that they have larger farms and so you expect them to be investing more, they're still investing more than any of those other classes, and they're investing more than the wind farm community. Notably, that amount that they're investing is more than they would be getting from the wind developer. What I'm hearing anecdotally from them is that they know that they're going to have this revenue coming in for 20 years, so they're deciding now to buy a tractor, or they're deciding now to tile their fields. And you can see their investment is across all different categories. Another thing that I asked about, again, because that first survey was really focused on farm and farmland preservation, was whether or not the landowner has a succession plan in place for their farm. And in the non-wind farm communities, that's around 60%. In the wind farm communities, those neighbors who are unpaid and those neighbors in the pool, similarly about 60% have a succession plan in place. People with turbines on their property, 80% of them have a succession plan in place. Again, people with larger farms are more likely to have a succession plan in place, but even when you control for that, they are still more likely to, if you have a turbine on your property, more likely to have a succession plan in place for your property than if you're in a non-wind farm community. Okay, so what are my takeaways about the individual level impacts? Their attitudes are really split 50-50 in terms of noise, visual impacts, property values. Those with a financial stake certainly have a rosier view of this. They're less bothered by noise. Those with no financial stakes, the noise and the visual impacts, they're really feeling those. But the opinions are still split in those two groups. So there are still people with turbines on their property that think they're noisy and ugly, and people who aren't getting paid who don't think that they're noisy and ugly. Most people don't see health impacts, but like I said, you have to decide for yourself if any health impacts are enough. or are okay. And then finally, having a turbine on your property is linked to additional on-farm investment and succession planning. Community level impacts. So there are a couple that are often talked about that I'll go over. I asked about more, but in the interest of time, I left them off. So one is that turbines create jobs. Most people, whether you're paid or unpaid, the majority told me, yes, turbines create jobs. That's 78%. Yes, 78% said they agree with that statement. A lot of them wrote on their survey, but not local jobs. So you should know that most of the jobs that are created locally are during construction in the hospitality industry, because when construction crews come in, they need some place to eat and they need some place to sleep. Aggregate haulers, which we heard a lot about earlier, their jobs in that. But that there's not really long-term jobs, or at least that's not the perception in these communities, and I haven't seen evidence of lots of long-term jobs being created. But people will tell you that they create jobs, but I would give it that caveat, because they give that caveat on the survey. The next item is the impact that turbines have on local roads. So you'll see that there's now, it looks white out here, it's gray, it should be gray on the handout. I've added a middle category. So now we're talking about whether turbines have greatly improved, somewhat improved, neither improved nor worsened, somewhat worsened, or greatly worsened local roads. 60% of people say that wind turbines have not changed the roads in their community. 27% that say that they've improved roads. And you might say, how would they improve roads? Because we hear that there's lots of heavy equipment coming through. So this was surprising to me too. It's that wind turbines are paying taxes, and those taxes go to local governments, and local governments tend to use that tax money for roads. Also, in a lot of the places where I've worked, the county road commission has regulations in place that say, if you're gonna bring these big heavy trucks down our roads, you need to be both buffering them in advance of those trucks coming, but also repairing any damages that you make. So 27% say roads have improved, but again, most people say that the roads haven't changed. What impact has it had on township services? And again, I mentioned that there's property tax revenues. Most people don't think that their township services have changed as a result of those tax revenues. 73% say township services haven't changed. There's more people that say it's improved than worsened, but it's marginal. I can talk about that a little bit later if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. The slides look very similar if you're talking about local schools and counties, which are county services. Those are the other levels of government that are also getting tax revenues from the wind development. The other thing that I asked about, community level impact, is the effect that turbines have had on relationships with neighbors. 64% say that the relationships with neighbors haven't changed. Here, though, where before people were more likely to say improved, here people say that if relationships have changed, they've worsened. So 30% say that their relationships with neighbors have worsened as a result of the wind development, and only 6% say they've improved. I would point out that statistically there's no difference between those that are paid and unpaid. So that hasn't changed. That doesn't make a difference. Okay, so my takeaways on the community level impacts, most do seek job creation, but I would say that there's this caveat that it's not local jobs, or that it's specific type of local jobs that you would see created. And the majority haven't seen changes to community services, schools, which I didn't show that slide, or relationships with neighbors. So would they do it all over again? If they could do it all over again, would they? That's the question that I effectively ask. And I have two different ways of measuring this. One is asking what impact they think that the turbines have had on their overall quality of life in the township. 55% say they don't believe that their quality of life has changed. 29% say it's worsened. And 16% say it's improved. This slide looks a whole lot like relationships with neighbors, which doesn't surprise me a bit, having grown up in a rural township in Michigan. That how we feel about our quality of life in our township really has to do with how we feel, whether we feel like this project has strengthened or hindered our relationships with neighbors. So that doesn't surprise me. I asked them, would you be willing to host additional turbines in your township? Again, these are townships that already have turbines. And attitudes are split here. 42% told me that they would support hosting additional turbines. 36% said that they would oppose it, and 23% were on the fence about it. The attitudes are split. There are differences between those that are paid and unpaid, but again, not as stark as you might imagine going into it, not as stark as I would have imagined going into it. All right, so what are my general recommendations to you? My PhD comes from planning. So I approach this with planning in mind. And again, my PhD, I didn't talk very much about it, was about are wind turbines a farmland preservation technique? And if so, how? But I'm a planner. I'm gonna tell you, you should think about how this fits with your long-term plan. And if your long-term plan is for substantial residential growth or to boost tourism, those two classes of land uses, people tend not to like wind turbines. So I don't think wind turbines fit.
Would you prefer questions after you're finished?
Yeah, I'm almost done. There's just a couple slides left. We'll come back to it. If your goal is to sustain agriculture, I would say that wind can fit. Again, I've written a 200-page plus document on this, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this. The caveat that I would get, because this is what I say, this is what I think my research has found, is they take up land. What about that? It's true they take up land, and when they're sited smack dab in the middle of a field, that is not preserving that farmland. Some wind developers are siting them on property lines, on fence rows. And in my mind, though, if those fence rows weren't being farmed anyway, that's not really taking out farmland. And so I think particularly if these are being sited on property lines, that they can go a long way towards helping preserve agriculture, sustain agriculture. Again, with my planning hat on, in looking for this, one of the things from this Mott study was trying to understand why some communities with wind farms want additional ones and some communities don't. They've said enough is enough and we don't want any more. I want there to be a zoning silver bullet and to give you the magical setback distance that will make everybody happy. I can't find that. I haven't found that. So what this slide is showing is in the townships that I've looked at, those 10 townships, what their zoning or what their setback distance is and whether or not they would support additional turbines in that township. On the far left is a township that is unzoned. So there are no rules in terms of noise, setback distance, anything. And 52% say they would support additional turbines. On the far right is a township where the setback distance is 1,320 feet. And I could get the noise limits for you, but I don't have that. 30% say they would support additional turbines, and 45% say they would oppose it. Happiness is not necessarily all in the numbers, but that's not to say that what you're doing isn't important. The guidance that I would give is that clearly some of the things that I've shown is that being paid or unpaid isn't going to make everybody happy. But people do have different attitudes based on what kind of financial stake they have in the project. And so a zoning ordinance that distinguishes between participating and non-participating landowners, that's people who are getting paid and those are not, I think that's a smart way to go. Asking the wind developer to analyze noise and flicker and what it's going to do at properties is a good thing to do. People ought to know whether or not they're going to be able to hear these from their houses, whether that flicker is going to be a problem. A lot of people, most of the places that I've surveyed do have decommissioning plans in place, but the residents don't know about them. And so having a decommissioning plan and making sure that there's a financial assurance and making sure that the community understands how that's going to work so that, like the previous thing, you don't have an out-of-town bond or say, I know we're not paying the bond. Like, that's really important because that's a concern that people continue to have. The other thing is having an open and transparent process like you guys are doing, I think is really important. I want to leave you with this slide and then answer any questions. So this is across the bars across the bottom are whether people strongly agreed to strongly disagreed with the statement that I had ample opportunity to provide input during the wind project planning stage. So you can see in the strongly agree category, those blue bars, we've got 74% say that they would be in support of hosting additional turbines in their township. So if you strongly agreed that you had an ample opportunity to provide input, you're willing to welcome even more turbines. If you strongly disagree that you had ample opportunity to provide input during the planning stage, you strongly oppose any additional development, and that makes sense. I have given this presentation, I think I did pretty close to 20 minutes. I've given it in an hour though, so there's lots more information. I have a website there where I've posted a lot of it, including the survey instruments themselves so that you can see the questions that I've asked. Madam Chairwoman, I entertain questions. Can I make one plug that Mott is paying for my travel here, like as part of the grant, and the county didn't have to do anything, but I'm supposed to get feedback for them. And this really helps me because I sent a letter to 300 different places saying, you can invite me if you want to learn more about wind. So telling you how I can improve and what you learned is really helpful. So please, if you could write some comments, I'd appreciate it. But
Thank you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your time out here. At this point, I would entertain any questions, first from the planning commissioners and then from the audience. And again, please direct those to me at the chair, and I will help facilitate the answer process. Planning commissioners, yes.
Did you do anything on sound itself, any dB work or hydro difference?
the only question I asked about sound was that noise question, whether they cause noise pollution. Yeah. And even within the planning literature, that hasn't been talked about. Urban planning literature, like what's the right noise level? There's a paper out of Canada about setback distances looking at that part, but I haven't even seen anything talking about planning ordinance levels.
Sarah, I've noticed on TV there's a commercial from City Business. They're financing wind turbines offshore. I think it's in a place in Maine. There's an island up there, and they've been getting all of their electricity for the last 30 or 40 years, they say, from diesel fuel, running generators on the island.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're putting up these wind towers out in the ocean, and they're feeding electricity back to the island. Now, there was a question, or not a question, but a statement on the board that in areas of tourism, towers aren't real popular.
Yep.
But say along the coast, that's where you're going to get most of your wind, right?
Exactly.
Higher amounts of wind. So there is the reason we don't have wind turbines up in the Traverse City area is because of the wealth that's concentrated there in the tourism.
The project that's in Ludington was very, very contentious. And I mean, it's right along Lake Michigan. You could have predicted that. The same is true in parts of, well, I mean, this in Huron County has been part of the discussion. They are a county where their economy is both agriculture and tourism. And so right now, the Planning Commission is trying to figure out how do you balance those two goals. In places like Gratiot County, where I hope I don't offend anybody from Gratiot County, there's not a whole lot of tourist activity in Gratiot County. The wind process was not contentious. It was largely because they were able to figure out what they wanted out of wind before wind developer came. And then they even you know, after that, they were able to say, look, we're farmers. Like, this is another way that we can get revenue off of our land, and we can still farm underneath it. And so that's why, going back to those couple of slides, it's really, we see very different, there's not very many researchers around the US that are doing this. But experiences out of Iowa towards wind are very different than those out of New England. I am working with somebody in Iowa, and she will say, like, there's just not tons of tourism in Iowa.
Right.
So
you, if I can continue, you could go, the wind companies are going to the path of least resistance, but they also may get less wind if they go inland versus being on the coast.
So if you look at the wind maps, the windiest places in Michigan, the windiest places are along the coast. I don't know I don't know the full economics of this. One of the things that I have heard, and my first degree is in engineering, so I tell my people I'm a reformed engineer, or a recovering engineer. But the higher up you go, the more steady the winds are, and so more places come into play. So places that on original wind maps, when turbines were short, you would say you can't develop a wind farm there. Now the technology, like when you have higher turbines and newer technology, you're able to more profitably capture wind, even in places that aren't so windy. Gratiot County is a great example. If you look on a wind map, Gratiot County is not standing out as fantastic wind resources. And when I was doing my research, they had the biggest wind farm in the state. I don't know if it's since been surpassed, but at that time in 2014, they had the biggest wind farm in the state. They were not the windiest. They made an ordinance that said, hey, wind developers, we want you to come here. But also they were in a place, the technology was at the point where they could reasonably, economically capture wind at that place and at that point and make it work financially.
Thank you.
Another question, that you talked about taxes in there.
Yeah.
So you're not seeing a boatload of tax money coming from these to help sustain townships and counties?
So there is a boatload of tax money from these. One of the townships that I looked at in Huron County, now this is the township with the most wind development in the state, right? Their property tax revenues quintupled the year after the turbines were built. Quintupled. Even in that township, people are telling me that they do not see a change in township services. I've done interviews because I wanted to figure out what that is. The property tax structure in the state of Michigan treats turbines as machinery that depreciates over time. So the most that the township or the county or whatever your taxing jurisdiction will make is in year 1. And it's going to go down to, I think it's 30% by year 10 or 12. I think it's 10. So the township supervisor knows that the most he's ever going to get, like that quintupling is happening year 1, but it's going to go down after that. So he doesn't want to introduce new services. Instead, he's going to gravel additional miles of road or pave, an extra mile. I mean, paving is expensive, so it's not like it's going to be that much. In his township, people don't see the benefits because they don't realize what it would have been otherwise. It's hard for people to say like, oh, there's not a sign that says this was provided by wind development revenues. And Huron County is the same thing. Huron County used those tax revenues to pay their OPEB debts, like to shore up their OPEB fund, is what my understanding is.
Yeah.
The difference, in fact, I'm going to go quickly back to this. There is one township in my study area, this one. Okay, so overall 22% of people said that township services improved. There's one township in my study area that introduced trash service. 60% of their residents said township services improved. Now, that trash service didn't cost tons of money, but people saw a new service, and so now they feel like it. So, you're not the body that should change the tax structure. But I think that my next study is going to really look at how this changes in other places that tax things differently. Because this depreciating cost, like you should know, there's money coming in, but the most you're ever going to get is in year 1. And depending on how you choose, you're planning commission, you don't have to approve the budget. But depending on how the township board and the county board chooses to use those dollars, it may be invisible to people, and that's what I'm seeing. In all of my research, this is the thing that's the most surprising to me. This is the most surprising to me.
Any other questions from the commission?
Just one. Have you compared your study to other studies done, and how does yours compare?
So other studies, yes and no. There are not lots of people working on wind energy, attitudes about wind energy in the US. In Europe, there's tons of literature, but they don't tax property tax, or they don't charge property taxes on turbines. There was just a study that was, or just a literature review, so pulling together all of the studies about what attitudes, or what shapes attitudes about wind, and it's finding largely the same things, that what they're calling procedural justice. So how you feel about the planning process and how you feel about the transparency of the local government and the wind developer is really important towards your attitudes. Distributive justice and whether or not you're getting paid, that is something that's been found to impact attitudes. In terms of, there hasn't been so much work on whether or not you are living in a farming community versus a community with other values. I just was looking up this morning, there's a study out of North Carolina that showed that people who value the area for recreational purposes are less excited about, or are more up in opposition to wind energy than those who don't use that area for recreational purposes. But I'll be honest, like, I've been struggling to find a peer group of scholars because I'm the only planner that's studying this, and I now sit in a department. There's just not a field of, this is not a field of study, and so it's really hard for people to find each other. I'm starting, and I can tell you a little bit more about it. But that's a good question.
Sarah, are you saying that there's more study and more of a track record in Europe than there is here?
Far more, there's a longer history, but in terms of studies about wind energy, significantly more research out of Europe.
In Europe, do they distribute the income from the wind turbines to not just property owners, but to the whole community? So
Europe is, I'm writing a paper about this right now because one of the studies that something that I'm writing for other audiences, Michigan has two business models of wind development. One that only pays people with turbines on their property, and one that gives direct payments to more people. That has, I am working on the lit review. People have talked about that as being something that ought to be studied, but it's not been studied to the best of my knowledge and the research assistants that I have helping me try to find that. So nobody else has that data. The research out of Europe are largely about community ownership, and that's a huge topic that they've been taking on for a while. And so this is people, actually buying a stake in it, or they're developed we have rural electric cooperatives. It's cooperative owning of the turbine itself. Also in Europe, because they don't have property taxes, there's a bigger system called community benefits agreements, which is effectively the wind developer there, because they're not going to pay the local government, they instead negotiate with the local government to say, hey, what do you need a new library? Do you want us to invest in your rec center? That kind of thing. That's something, there's much more literature from Europe on that. In my next study, which I hope to be in Ohio has something called payment in lieu of taxes, which is very similar. So instead of having a fixed tax rate, you can negotiate with the local government about what the wind developer can negotiate with the local government. And Ohio's not the only place, but other places have that too. That hasn't been looked at so much in the US, but that's another model.
Well, Europe is more socially liberal than we are here.
Yeah, so the paper that I was just reading this morning, to put it into context, there was an experiment in Norway to try to understand whether or not people wanted private compensation, that is, the wind developer paying you directly, or they would prefer this public compensation, or they would want no wind development at all. They had one person in their study say no wind development at all. Continuously, people wanted wind, it was just what benefits were they going to get. That, if that were replicated in the US, that would not be the case, is my gut sense. So we can have a conversation about why that is, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments from the commission? Okay, we'll open it up to the audience for any questions. Again, please direct your question to me, and then Sarah can...
This isn't part of my 3 to 5 minute comment later, correct?
Well,
I have a question for
I
you.
would say correct, yeah.
Okay. She said that Iowa has been more receptive to it. I can give her a contact person or several in Iowa that are not receptive to it, and it's all over social media, okay? So she can contact me and I can give her that information, that's all.
Thank you. Thanks. I've looked that. That'd be really helpful. Yes.
Has there been any attempt to reconcile the survey responses that you've received with the clear polling results in every election that has been conducted in Michigan that involved a wind project? Because Big Wind has not won any of them, not a single one. And so that seems to directly contradict the notion that it's 50-50 or well accepted.
Yeah, and just a minute. I don't have it in this slide deck, but I do have a slide. I'm doing this tomorrow. If it's okay, I can pull up a slide on this. Sometimes I am prepared. All right, so I am not a scholar of the referenda entirely. My understanding was yes, the May 2nd election, Wind lost big time. I thought that previously in some referenda in Huron County that wasn't the case, but I don't know for sure. But you're right. Here, May 2nd, bad in Huron County. And I was concerned because 7 of my response townships were from Huron County. So what in the heck is going on? So I pulled this slide together to help myself. Just assume that everybody knows that May 2nd, Huron County voted not to allow additional wind farms. That vote was, I think, 14 townships. There were multiple jurisdictions because it's county zoning. I only surveyed 5 of them. My survey from those 5 townships in Huron County, which I have enumerated there, in that survey, 39% told me they would support additional turbines in their township, 24% said they neither support nor oppose, and 37% said they would oppose. So it was pretty split in those townships in Huron County on my survey. The next line is from the county clerk. The votes in those townships. In those 5 townships, it was 45.5% in favor, 54.5% opposed, which I was happy to see that it was right in the middle of what they told me. So, because people can say survey data is crap, right? Like, I heard from 53% of people in these townships, and honestly, it was about 53% that voted. So I wanted to make sure that this wasn't total crap. Sorry, excuse my French. But you'll see that there was a different vote. The bar to the right was what happened countywide overall, where it was 36% in support, or 36.6% in support, 63.4% in opposition. In my analysis, because I got everything at the township level, townships that had wind turbines were more supportive of additional wind development than those townships that voted and that didn't. Now, again, it wasn't crazy different. It was 39 versus 40% in townships with built projects voted yay, 32% in townships without built projects voted yay, and then my question that I'm still struggling with is some wind townships were very in opposition, some were supportive. Bloomfield Township and McKinley Township, there was a majority who voted in favor of it. Why is this? I don't know. That is a research question, and that's something that I hope I can figure out so that people understand, like what's different about Bloomfield Township and Grant Township. But that's a really good question. I'm glad I had data for you.
Any other questions from the audience for Sarah? Yes.
Yes, going back to Europe, you said there was not much change with the setbacks for complaints. In Europe, they're all over a mile to 2 miles, and they've done it the longest.
So the setback, I am not familiar with the setback distance literature in Europe, I'll be honest.
They're all over a mile, some up to 2 to 3 miles.
Okay.
And they've been around the longest in Europe.
Yeah, I haven't, I'm not familiar with that. The setback distance literature that I looked to when I was kind of developing my study was a study out of Canada where they kind of compared what the setback distances were across. And again, setback distance, as a little anecdote, last night in the city of Ann Arbor, we had a discussion about medical marijuana and trying to figure out dispensaries and trying to figure out what the separation distance should be. I feel like it's really hard to figure out what that right distance is. I want there to be a universal, like, easy thing to point to, and at least in Europe is good model to draw from.
And they have increased it through the years. The setback always goes back further.
I'm gonna just point you back to my data. Again, maybe it's a Michigan anomaly. Very possible, and that's why I hope to do more research to figure this out. Oh, it's not in this one. Oh, it is.
In the United States, Michigan is 1 and 2 is the lowest restriction for setbacks at this point. This is something that I've looked at, is whether zoning is done at the state level or local, and Michigan isn't alone in allowing local governments to set the setback distances. And so my understanding is that there is no statewide standard. It's minimal.
And so.
California has 2 miles setback for their windmill in the whole state.
Yeah, I haven't looked at California. I would just again point to this and say setback distance doesn't necessarily mean happy.
Any other questions from the audience for Sarah?
Thank you for having me, and I will stick around for this discussion too. And please, if people have comment cards, if you could give them to me, I'd really appreciate it so I know what to say in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, we appreciate your efforts. Okay.
Okay, thank you. As approximately a week ago, staff sent to you and posted on the website revisions, a complete overhaul of the wind turbine ordinance, the WECS. Since that time, we've also had additional discussions with others and made some additional revisions to the document. So tonight, before you should have been a color copy. So these are essentially revisions since the last revision of the revisions that we've been doing. And if we add Mr. Nolan's red lines, then we're really revising. So, and I'm sure that after this, Mr. Nolan may also present additional, because some of these revisions are based on what he provided us in advance. I wanted to do that because I think sometimes when it's just brought up here before us, those red lines, we're at the point now that we're getting very close to possibly taking this off to the townships to get their input. So if you have your color highlighted copy with you, you can see if we got an extra one here.
I can give it back if the commission needs it.
We may need that. Oh, here, we have one right here. Okay, starting off with item 2, definitions on page 1 of 11. The amendments here were essentially to clean up the definitions. We started with the definitions and some of the administrative provisions. This was an attempt to essentially make sure it matched up with the rest of the ordinance. We did, however, make additional amendments since then based on other discussions. The definition for decibel was cleaned up, and we have the definition for dBA, which was cleaned up. And but we also added item F there, the LA max, maximum sound level, also provided to you as just a kind of a little web printout. We're going to be looking more into this. I think the concern of some individuals was that when we set our noise limit at the property line, that the developer would be able to contend that that was an average, whereas we would intend that to be a maximum, a do not exceed. They would possibly say that was a do not exceed average. So that's the clarification of that. We still have a little catching up to do on that term to make sure it's accurately used. If you flip over to 2 of 11, we also changed the definition of sound pressure and sound pressure level. Some of this we heard very early on in our discussion. Mr. Nolan had presented to us in the past, I think with a comment from Mr. James. It makes sense to add these. It is more consistent for our enforcement and more consistent with standards of review for engineers. Item M, again, we just clarified what a WECS is and what a commercial WECS farm was. Before we had utility scale and terms like that floating around. So again, definitions mostly clean up. If we go to page 3 of 11, kind of breakdown, cleaned up the process. WECS are still required, commercial ones are required to get special land use. In conjunction with others are considered a farm, so they get a special land use by township. Private WECS should be reviewed by our Office of Administrative Site Plans, so meeting the requirements herein. Agricultural WECS are exempt from our ordinance. Testing facilities would still require a special use permit. The reason that we look at that way is also to give folks in the neighborhood the idea that this may be coming. A special use permit has more enhanced notification requirements than just an administrative site plan or site plan review. Going to bottom of page 3 of 11, general standards. I mean, here we start off noise levels and going into page 4. And I, for one, if you got a question, write on something, let's hit it now. And then Mr. Nolan will speak and then we'll open up to the public. But top of page 4, again, looking at the noise impact, we did have in and we took out and we had in some ANSI category, where we find certain provisions of the ANSI code. We did put that back in, per some comments received. We also made sure that we did talk about ambient and potential noise impact created by commercial WECS and talk about that should be specifically addressed at non-participating property boundaries and non-participating property, or participating and non-participating boundaries there. We also talk about the noise study and looking at what needs to be done there to show the Planning Commission what the potential impact would be from a WECS. Again, we use the term at the middle of the page there, the LA max, and staff has suggested at this time, and staff is simply suggesting we're here to provide to you kind of what we feel that we're seeing from the other communities, what we feel that we're seeing from this community, and other discussions that we may have had with the Planning Commission over time. We're setting it at 45 decibels at the non-participating property line. So we also took out, we've had out the DVC, which is the subsonic noise. This dBA level, coupled with the setbacks that we're looking at suggesting, we don't think that that's necessarily going to be an issue. Now, that can be argued by an engineer, we're just planners, but that's kind of the feel that we get for this. And again, the county has the right at any time to request additional assistance for our office in the form of a noise engineer, acoustician, or an engineer to talk about setbacks. Moving on, yes.
Question, did you want to address any ideas that we have at this point?
Absolutely.
Okay, item 3, I like everything in there personally, but I can't really remember why we chose property line as opposed to habitable structure.
Right, and part of that was a lot of discussion here, and then what we heard from the public is that essentially, my habitable structure may be on the east side of the 80. Why can't I build a house on my west side of my 80? Because now I'm in an existing improvements noise field, for lack of a non-engineering word. And so that's why we started moving back to the property line instead of at the habitable structure. It's been called several things, but essentially, if we had an 80, we had a turbine that was causing noise for half of the 80 at a higher decibel there, but did not exceed the structures at the exterior, what that essentially meant if that person wanted to use the other 80 of their property, that they would be essentially in what we consider elsewhere in the ordinance not, I want to say healthy, but not acceptable for the general population. So we'll be restricting the use essentially of the rest of the property.
So they would not be able to build, say, the property to their child and build a house on the other side.
Right. Our previous language said at the habitable structure, and so we were essentially encroaching with our regulation onto the rest of the property. At least that's, that's where we're landing right now, with what we've heard and what was discussed. Move on. Height, always a popular subject. I think we got a lot of this discussion started. Staff did back down to the 500 feet on the maximum height. However, we do give the Planning Commission in this language the ability to increase that to not more than 600 feet if it can be shown by the developer, and the Planning Commission can request additional information, that one, that the 600 feet has become an industry standard, and two, that it substantially decreases the number of wind turbines that would be affecting the area or be implemented in the area. So if the Planning Commission decides not to do that, then they don't. They don't have to. So we just moved it back to what it was originally back in 2008. Yeah,
I have a question in regards to that. I mean, personally, I've never seen anything written like that where that's such a loophole that, of course, a wind turbine company is going to come and say, surely the wind's a lot better 100 feet higher, or 700 feet, or 800 feet. That's a huge loophole that we'll be addressing every single time we get a special use permit for a wind turbine. Every single time. And if we don't accommodate with this kind of language in here, that's an open lawsuit just waiting to happen. You've got it in here, we can make that decision, or whoever, I'm not going to be on planning commission forever, but whatever planning commission is working is going to be confronted with that question every single time. Is that? I've never seen an ordinance that's that wishy-washy. It could be 500. Oh, well, it could be 550, or it could be 575, or 6. To me, it's one or the other. I just think that's an open door for just total chaos when it comes to special use permits. That's my feeling on that.
And I agree somewhat. I think that special use permits are extremely subjective. There are a lot of their language. We just discussed harmonious a little bit tonight. If everybody writes down the definition of harmonious on a piece of paper tonight, we will generally not have, maybe a couple of planners will come up with a textbook answer, but we won't come up with that.
But there's no data on 600-foot wind turbines, so how can we even address something that there's no data on?
Well, I think that what you said was just very important. How do we? And so staff, again, is trying to take an ordinance that we had in place over years, modify that, because we did, this planning commission that preceded you did feel that the developer had presented enough information that 600 foot was appropriate. Now we're backing down to the 500 foot mark because we find in our spreadsheets that that's more middle of the road. However, do we want to keep amending, are we going to come back with the developer coming to us and saying, look guys, at 600 feet, I can put up 15 turbines instead of 30. And at that point, though, do we want to have to go through the 3-month process of amending our ordinance, or do we want to give the planning commission some leeway and some latitude to make a decision, to request additional information. So-
It doesn't matter whether, however you write it, a planning commission can amend an ordinance. So you don't, I mean, you're starting right out, putting it in there. I say, take it out. And, you know, let the other, I mean, leave it up to the planning commission. This opens the door for anybody who's applying.
This leaves,
Saying, well, it's in your ordinance, so, you know, I want a 600 foot. So
it leaves it to the planning commission still the discussion here, but we're also looking at timing. To amend an ordinance takes 3 months. In this case, it's going to take almost a year and something to amend this entire thing. So, but that is something for, luckily I don't have to make the decisions. I just throw out wild recommendations. You guys have to make the hard decisions, so. But moving forward here, going to item C on the property line setbacks. Now, here we made some, I think we made some, one of the more substantial increases here. And the way we looked at this is that we went from, I can't remember if that was 150, we were up to the 300% of the siting of a commercial WVCS from a non-participating property line. Now, you can look at that certain ways, and we heard some comments tonight, you know, setbacks doesn't necessarily make everybody happy. The way that I've looked at the setback issue is that if a developer feels that it's a viable area and they do want to gather as many leases as possible, then that setback can be met by leasing property. And therefore having more of the general population buy in by their own personal decisions to sign a lease and become a participating property. That is my entire rationale for that, is that, you know, we've heard some comments about the wind industry themselves, the construction crews having to stay so far back. Mr. Nolan at the last meeting provided evidence that they found stuff far flung, you know, as you know, 3, 4, maybe 5 times the height of the tower. And he may have some additional recommendations for you tonight. But that's the simplistic way that I'm looking at it, is that I think it helps us meet our decibel levels, including the DVC, if we have a farther setback. And what we're requiring essentially with the setback is more ownership in the community of the project. That's why we're putting that up there. But again, you know, that's something that we can amend tonight and correct tonight or change tonight.
Commissioners, what are your thoughts? Originally, we had that at 150%. This was item C,
Item D.
Item
No,
D.
no, C1D. I'm sorry.
C1D. Looking at it from the landowner perspective, again, we want to think about availability of properties at 300% versus what we had it at 150%.
Say that again. Look at,
It was prior at 150%, it's now changed to 300%. We have to make a decision on what we want to go with for that setback to non-participating property line.
it's basically for commercial, not residential.
Right, residential, private is 150%.
Mhm.
That's item C1C. If you look at item C1D,
It's 300%.
right,
And it's often as well written. That's my own thing.
There'll be a lot of people a lot happier with 300%.
Sir, you mentioned that in Europe, they have them up to 1-2 miles apart,
From
tower to tower?
From residents.
Oh, from residents?
5,000 feet, plus.
Yeah. So if we had a 500-foot tower, we'd have to go percentage-wise
Go somewhere else.
to make one.
That'd be great.
1,500 feet.
1,500 feet.
Madam Chair, can I comment on that?
Yes.
At the 300%, which is what staff is recommending right now, that puts you at 1,500 feet. As you may recall, I presented documentation to you before from the manufacturers that say in the event of an overspeed event, you need to retreat 500 meters. Coincidentally, that's 1,500 feet. So if you were to keep this, you are adhering to the manufacturer's recommendation on a retreat zone. I think that leaves very little margin for error, but I think 300 should be your bare minimum that you would consider because that's what the manufacturers of the turbines are telling you. I think you would be well served to consider something a little beyond that for a buffer, especially if you're going to look at a 600-foot turbine, which there's no documentation on a safety zone for a 600-foot turbine.
Then again, code 600, it's 300 times.
It adds another 300 feet, but if you've got another 100 feet of turbine, how much further is that debris going to go? It may go more than an additional 300 feet. We don't have any data to track that because, to my knowledge, I think there's a couple of 600-footers in Ohio. I'm not aware of any other location in the United States right now that has 600 footers. So you're taking a little bit of a risk there that if they do put them in, you're taking the risk that you're confident that it won't throw debris more than 300 foot further than what a 500-foot tall turbine would. And if you're looking at the math on this, if it's a 20% increase in height, I'd say you'll see a 20% increase in the distance. So you're probably pretty close, but there's no fudge room there. There's no room for error.
Thank you. Any other comments from the commission?
Would anybody, Madam Chair, would anybody have, say we went 500%? You think that?
I would immediately start getting concerned that I think that with, as you recall, we put together all these ordinances from the state what we would consider somewhat reasonable and tried to kind of fall in the middle. Even with the 300%, I think we're pushing it somewhat to be outside of the reasonable. Again, as you can, later on in the agenda, the county has endured some litigation. The county has to endure that from time to time. But part of my job is to kind of find that middle ground. I think 500%, and if the planning commission wants to be the tip of the spear, they can. I think that's pushing what's existing in the state of Michigan for those communities that are actually have development right here. There's some townships out there that are never going to get land but adopted an ordinance that have what we may consider unreasonable setbacks. So 500%, just in my opinion, is starting to push that limit.
But Shiawassee County is probably more populated than Huron County, correct?
That could be the case, but we didn't do that in depth of a study. Okay, we just looked at what essentially, what other ordinances and other languages out there.
And from the ordinance perspective, I mean, you can't write it so that it's so prohibitive that it couldn't take place. So we just have to be very careful with the language, which is why we're here.
But if you add a waiver, you can make it absolutely exclusionary. And I provided that case law to your presence.
And we didn't want to touch the waiver issue at this time. I mean, that's I think we've made significant inroads with what we're presenting tonight. So we'll keep moving forward with that. Let me jump into setbacks for principal and accessory setbacks. Accessory structure setbacks on participating properties. That participating property is added just so we're clear that it does not include non-participating, it is participating properties. Whereas if somebody wants to sign up for a lease and their house is 100% away from a 500-foot tower, that's their call. Public right-of-ways, 100, and utility lines, 100, the height of the tower. Flipping over now to shadow flicker, taking the stance that, especially from the last meeting, and cleaned up this language with some additional comments from others, that essentially that shadow flicker be prohibited on non-participating properties, which is the same kind of concept of setback versus at the property line versus, or noise at the property line versus at the inhabited structure. If we allow shadow flicker to occur on 50% of the farm, but they wanted to sell a portion of it off or build an animal barn back there, Will the shadow flicker have any impact on the animals? I don't know, but why not just limit it at where the person's property line is? We also have in there, and this was provided by Mr. Nolan, we've noted it as for consideration, this shadow impact module SIM by Nortec, which is essentially something that would be installed to abate shadow flicker occurring in non-participating properties. Staff's not comfortable just recommending that right off the bat, but it's for your consideration, and maybe Mr. Nolan can explain how that system works as well. We also removed the at no point shall shadow flicker fall on the portion of public road or non-participating property for more than 30 minutes a day, or 30 minutes a day, or 30 hours per year, if we're going to prohibit it, like saying allow it. So that was a handy, nice little cleanup for us. Thank you. Yes.
In paragraph 1, you say there will be no shadow. So why would they need something to measure it?
And then that's why we're kind of on the fence of it. And I think even in item 2 there, we have some cleanup talking about, we have a shadow flicker impact analysis, and I think we even say something about minimize or mitigate, where we're saying stops at the property line, just tell us that you're not gonna, you're gonna shut the thing down during that period of time that your studies show that you'll have shadow flicker on the property. Again, all this is negated if everybody signs up.
If I may, the equipment is not to measure the shadow flicker. The equipment that's recommended, which has been around for at least 6 or 7 years. Sir, the equipment's been around for at least 6 or 7 years. It's not there to measure shadow flicker. It's a system that's put in place that, to my understanding, will recognize when shadow flicker is occurring and shut down the turbine so that it doesn't keep occurring. And then when the sun moves out of position so that it would no longer be casting a shadow in a prohibited area, the turbine restarts again.
Okay.
So it's not just a measurement tool, it's a prevention tool.
Moving along, item E, page 6 and 11 at the bottom, the decommissioning plan. We talked about this most recently. Some amendments have been made in here, especially from Mr. Nolan's comments made at the last meeting. But we did clean things up to talk about that we get an estimated cost of decommissioning, that we have the plan, that we also have some steps put in place that after 90 days if something is considered broken or abandoned, what happens after those steps. We are putting a lot of that onto the Planning Commission to essentially walk through the revocation process and to implement the bond. I imagine this being a special land use, and if we got into a project this big with this much steel and concrete out there, I would imagine that we would invoke legal counsel, and legal counsel would help us write up the special land use per these general directions. And even then, being a special land use, additional conditions can be levied. So just keep that in mind that we can't foresee everything here, but at that time, and not in a rush, but actually sitting down with the developer and coming up with a decommissioning plan and having all these things set in place. Number 5 here, I do need to change including all materials above and below the ground. We need to have like a 4 or 5 foot depth on the concrete foundation so that if it does get removed, it can still be farmed over. But we're not out there with 20, 30 foot holes in concrete. Would be very expensive to bring them up. So you can see the decommissioning plan here. Item 6B on the page 7 of 11, we have 125% estimated removal. Under C, we have the Planning Commission shall annually review the cost. I think there was some concerns with the subjectivity of may or can from time to time review, but actually impressed on the Planning Commission to do it every year. Flipping the page, and something I was thinking about, we were talking about that mining operation. We might as well make sure the surety bond or security is held here in the state of Michigan so we don't run into that problem again. I'd like to add that. Enforcement's pretty much the same. We're kind of relying on our office and mechanisms that we already have. Let's see. Safety measures, just some clarifications on page 9 of 11. H, additional consideration. This is, Mr. Nolan mentioned before that there is a aircraft detection lighting system. That is a recommendation to the planning commission, if you'd like to see that in there. What essentially this says is that the lights stay off on top until an airplane that's flying at that height with typical aircraft responders in there would then set these lights off, but they came within a certain distance of them.
Can I ask a question? So they radar or something like that there? Or?
I'm gonna, this is what we understand to be the typical providers of this. Mr. Nolan may be more apprised on what these aircraft detection, how they work. Is it based on radar?
It is a radar activated system, yes.
So if that radar were happen to be covered up with snow or something, I just want to make sure it's a fail-safe mechanism.
Again, I'm not a representative of the two companies. They advertise that they meet and exceed all FAA requirements, so I have to believe that the FAA would take into consideration that you might have snow or other possible, rain, whatever, that could impact it and wouldn't approve those types of programs or these types of utilities if they weren't capable of operating in all weather conditions.
And I think that's part of the reason we're kind of saying, for your guys' consideration at this time. The only really additional thing here is under K studies, which actually should be J because the way our format is screwed up. We do ask for an avian study that is not only for migratory birds but game birds as well. We have heard from several that the northwest corner of the county does have a healthy pheasant population and concerns that those game birds will be impacted.
That's just don't migrate.
I know, migratory birds and game birds, just the game birds in the area.
And it doesn't apply to them if you have to.
No.
Just responding to concerns. But that concludes what we have right now and what we're recommending to be picked to the township. This is up to the planning commission to amend any of this, all of this. Even though we are under a schedule, if the planning commission does not feel that it's ready to move on this particular document to the township, then we simply wait a month and go through it again. And the board of commissioners will have to extend the moratorium.
I would move then that we put this out to the townships and have them come back with any recommendations they have to help us do our job better.
Support?
It's been moved and supported.
And then, Chair, I do think that we've offered to the public opportunity to speak before we move
Okay,
on
yes.
any motion.
Yep.
Good point. Thank you.
I just want to bring up the fact too that originally this language was devised by a planning commission beginning in 2008. And we did send it out to the townships 3 different times for input, and it came back. In most cases, there was not much, if any, input from the townships. So I just want to make sure that everyone is very clear that that was an open and very transparent process. A lot of people don't feel that, but it was there. And if you look in the township minutes, if you can go back, you'll see that beginning in fall of 2008, right on through every time we revised and looked at the language. It should be there in your township minutes. Okay, so moving forward with what, commissioner input or
It's up to you if you want to hear from the audience first.
one more time?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take comments from the audience. Again, it's after
I have
10
one
o'clock.
question, Madam
So I
Chair.
just ask that you please limit your comments because we have other business to do tonight.
My question is, every time I come, I find these papers and it says the staff recommends. Who is the staff?
That would be our zoning administrator.
So you have one person calling himself a staff?
No.
And they're making these?
No.
They write this up?
They, With the research being done, and Pete, I'll let you address this because you're our administrator.
Sure. The Community Development Department with the county, and we have 3 staff members that have been working on this with input from other professionals that we know. And so we've been primarily responsible for gathering this information and presenting it back to the Planning Commission.
I'd like to see those names posted so we know who these people are that are making the staff recommendations. I mean, you're saying yourself with other people. I'm just
With
curious.
Mike and Matt. I mean,
Okay, those-
we're available in the Community Development Department. This is known by, I think, many in the community, that it's usually us 3 that are the ones that are working on that.
Well, I'm not being, hard about this, but it seems to me if you're proud of the work you're doing, you put your names down. And that's all I'm saying in this report would be helpful.
In an
Someone
official,
might-
in an official staff report, such as the previous ones you saw here tonight with the gravel committee, our names are at the bottom of those so the planning commission knows who the primary staff member is. And in that case, if we were to enter into litigation, we know the primary staff person.
Right now, you're the primary staff person, is that correct? That's
I've
maybe-
been that way since 2008.
I understand, but for this purpose of my knowledge, that's what you're telling me. That you're the person.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I take all responsibility for the community development
Thank
department.
you.
Falls on my shoulders.
Yes, sir.
All right, excuse me. I passed this out a couple of months ago, but I wasn't allowed to talk about it, so I'll do that this time. Probably not have that. It's just numbers. I started talking, but wasn't allowed to. Uh-oh, hope I got enough.
Thanks.
Okay, first of all, Sarah did a survey, and a survey is just, it's basically, she even said it's a research of opinion. And if you remember the opinion polls before the election, the national election, I think Hillary was a shoo-in, but the results show differently. I have the results of 4,000 votes approximately in Huron and Elmer and Sanilac County. Thereabouts, about 4,000. I believe she has results from 1,200 and some people. Okay? 1,900, if you look at this, 1,900 approximately the vote in Huron County to not allow the wind turbines, where their slogan was enough is enough, was 1,900 approximately to 1,100, no more. Their setback is, I think it's 1,640 feet at the house.
Madam Chair, can I interject here?
Yes.
I'm concerned that we are late in the evening.
Yeah, I'm gonna have 3 minutes.
If you can, I know, but I think that what the idea was is that we would receive comment on the language presented.
On the language.
So when do I bring this up, since last time I was
Well,
here?
I guess you could put it in writing, but, we're actually have to take a vote after this item. to
I
continue
understand.
With additional business. So I don't know about the planning commission, if the planning commission wishes to, I just think we should concentrate and maybe even offer Mr. Nolan a chance to, because the last comments either had to do with staffing or a vote that took place in another community.
Yeah, we'll be here till midnight. I appreciate your comments, but we really need to move on. We need to talk about this specifically.
So when can I talk about this part right here? Because I was asked last time. I don't know when.
Right out,
And
and give
then,
it to us, this we can actually look at it and read it. Because trust me, I do so much reading on this stuff.
yeah, I know, but I want the people to hear it. That's why I want to do that. See, so how do I do this so the people hear it as I'm wasting time asking?
It's not wasting time.
I
Well,
just
I
say
know.
under general public comment that we move along now, and then at the next meeting or the next meeting after that, under the public comment at the top of the item.
Okay, I can do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, you can have it. Yeah, I've got that.
Madam Chair, if I may. Thank you. As always, I've got some handouts for you guys, so I will distribute them. As Mr. Preston alluded to, we have been speaking a little bit over the last few weeks. And I went through and done a red line of the ordinance. Some of the changes I recommended have already been included by Mr. Preston in his recommendations, some not, so I want to go through them quickly. You'll see right away on page 1 some language added to the ambient sound level, that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night, and that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that it be done during the quietest time of evening or night. And that That was a recommendation from the acoustician Rick James, and that is because of gamesmanship that I have seen and he has seen in other locations where they will chain a sound testing machine to a stop sign at a busy intersection and use that to try to declare what ambient noise is, so that they can jack up that number and say, see, your ambient noise is 55 decibels. You'll never even hear these turbines. So the gamesmanship is something that I've experienced personally, and that I hope you're going to use my experience to avoid in your futures. You'll also see that I've added in a definition for DVC. As you may recall, I informed you before that DVC is typically that bass feeling. That's that noise that you feel more than you hear. That is going to be the subject of your biggest complaints. And your ordinance needs to address that. You need to measure it. You need to make sure that they're in compliance, because that's going to be the biggest source of complaints. And the LA Max has already been added in. Frankly, that's probably your most important addition to this ordinance at this time, as that is the subject of litigation in Sanilac County, where a developer had attempted to game language that was similar to yours, where it said shall not exceed, and they said, well, it doesn't give the interval at which we measure sound, so therefore it's an hourly average. And so far the court has not been real receptive to that argument, but that's what they're trying to do. This will prevent you from running into that problem. Moving on, there's a couple other definitional changes that I had recommended, I think, which have actually been adopted. Moving on to the noise. Some of the changes have been incorporated, which would be the ANSI specifics, and making sure we measure along property lines. That's important. But I'm recommending that you change your noise limit to 40. That's consistent with other locations. That's consistent with recommendations from the World Health Organization. I understand that that may give heartburn to some who might be a little bit concerned about litigation and some claim of exclusionary zoning. I will tell you from my experience that those claims are much ado about nothing, but nonetheless, if you're concerned, one way you could address that is have a 45-day and a 40-night. At night is when it's going to be its quietest. At night is when the vast majority of your residents are going to be trying to sleep, and when the noise interruption is going to cause the greatest annoyance and interference with their daily lives. That type of approach has been adopted in other locations, including in Riga Township. I will tell you, when Riga Township was sitting in your position, they had, we had Exelon there, we had UV Wind, and there was a third one. I want to say it was Iberdrola, but I can't recall. All three threatened litigation. Oh, we'll sue, you can't do this, you'll exclude us, we'll sue. Riga adopted a 45-day, 40-night at the property line in 2011. And as I sit here today, not one lawsuit has been filed against them. It's eminently reasonable, it's based upon the science, and it's a regulation that is passed to further a legitimate governmental interest, which is protecting the health, safety, and welfare of your residents. So if you're concerned about a flat 40, by all means, I would encourage you to adopt a 45-day and 40-night, and that's actually statewide now adopted in the state of New Hampshire. So I think it definitely falls within that rule of reasonableness. You're not going to be too far out on a limb to adopt that. And that was actually part of the Michigan State updated document that has mysteriously vanished. But I have hard copies of that and would be happy to provide them to anyone. I think we may have already provided them. Moving on, the other thing that I have added in here is the Dvc noise limit of 50 Dvc. That's that low frequency noise. It's considerably higher than the dBA, which is based upon audible hearing. But a 50 Dvc is based upon Mr. James's recommendations and the studies that he's done around the country dealing with infrasound and the impacts that it has. And then to also provide you some additional assurance that you're not going to be subject to tremendous litigation, I've added back in the waiver provision. Because as I've provided the case law to the panel before, the case law in Michigan says if you've got a waiver, you can have language that is almost downright exclusionary. And then if it gives the waiver and lets the citizens decide, it passes muster. And so by adding this back in, it provides you with greater protection from litigation and allows you to provide greater protections to your residents.
Mr. Nolan?
Yes, sir.
You just spoke about the waiver. Would that mean the county votes on it?
No, the waiver would be a waiver signed by the individual landowner who says, I've looked at this issue and I'm making an individual choice that I'm willing to accept higher noise limits at my property.
And there's language in here that says if you want that to run with the land, that has to be then recorded so that any person that comes along and who might want to buy that land understands that this particular parcel is going to be subject to a higher noise limit. Typically, that waiver would be signed in response to some sort of compensation. And then I would expect that that compensation would be passed along to the next landowner at that time. But that provides protection for you, that you don't have to be so concerned about litigation. The other change I had made on there, Mr. Preston has already recommended, but I will just speak briefly on it. There was some language in 2 where the actual noise limits are listed that talked about short-term events such as utility shortage or weather events and some exceptions. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, that language is an exception that swallows the rule. That would allow you to be awoken for 1 minute, 3 times, every hour, 8 hours a night, and they'd still be in compliance with the ordinance. So your citizens could be woke up 24 times a night, and they would have no recourse whatsoever. So I'm very pleased to see that staff has recommended that that language be removed, and I would encourage you to follow staff's recommendation on that issue. Next up is the height, and we've heard some debate about that already tonight. I will agree with Mr. Preston that there are some loosely written regulations out there that float around. But I'm here to tell you there's no such thing as an industry standard in this industry. You may recall Mr. Martis talked about when he was sitting in your seat on the Planning Commission in Riga Township when he was here several months ago. And he talked about how he had 3 different wind developers come in and they told him 3 different sounds were the industry standard, 45, 50, and 55 dBA. Clearly there's no consistency here. There is no industry standard. So I think you're going to have a hard time with language that talks about an industry standard for 600 feet. On top of that, I think it's the wrong focus. Your job is not to protect the wind industry. Your job is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the residents of Shiawassee County. That's your primary #1 goal of every single planner. In so doing, you want to look at what is your community willing to accept? What aesthetically are you willing to accept? Are you willing to look at 500, 600 foot tall structures? Or are you going to look around and say, wow, that's really out of place around here? I will tell you that you've got a lot of leeway in this. There's only one case that I'm aware of that's out there on this issue. It's a federal case known as the Janacek case. And in that case, the court upheld a height limit of, I believe it was just the general height limit of 35 feet in the township. When the landowner sued and said, you can't do that, you're excluding my turbines. The court said, that's perfectly within the purview of the Planning Commission and of the county to zone that way. So your goal should be looking at what is the community willing to accept, what's not going to cause problems in our community, not looking at what do the wind developers want. I would advise that you limit it to 500 feet or less. A number of other communities have limited it to considerably less than 500 feet. The other thing is relatively minor, but in the property line setbacks, it talks about between participating parcels. I've had a lot of experience with games with lawyers, and I can tell you that some lawyer will say, well, here's a participating parcel, here's a participating parcel, this one in the middle's not, but we're in between 2 participating parcels. So I don't have to have that long of a setback. So that's why I'm advocating that you include language that says it's on an adjacent contiguous parcel. So you take that argument away. Just eliminate one possible game that you don't have to deal with. Minor change to the language, and I think it furthers the intent that staff was trying to make there to begin with. I would also say that you probably want to increase the property line setback for some of these smaller, for testing facilities, for example. If you've got a Met tower out there and it falls, do you really want it at exactly the same distance away from a structure or from somebody else's property? There needs to be a little buffer zone there. We need a safety factor involved. I'm recommending 150%. Obviously, that's subject to discussion, but I wouldn't put it at just 100%. Even if you go 110%, you're going to give a little bit of cushion there for debris to go flying, because if it falls straight down and it's 100%, where's the debris going to go? It's going to go into the structure or into the neighbor's property or somewhere that it frankly doesn't belong. And then you'll see I'm recommending that you do a 400% setback. That is the same setback that was adopted in Riga Township, which again has been in existence since 2011, and there's been no litigation there. So that is a clearly an acceptable setback as we've seen in other places. And it's going to provide that margin for error that I talked to you about earlier. Because as we know, the manufacturers are saying 1,500 feet for a 500-foot tall turbine. We don't have any idea what they say for a 600-foot tall turbine, but this will make sure that you've got some buffer zone there, some room for error in case something tragic does happen. And as we've seen with the statistics that I provided previously, you are statistically certain to have at least 2 incidents at this project if it were to be built. That doesn't mean it's certain in reality, but statistically it's going to happen. Moving forward, again, I've got a little bit of a buffer on the public rights of way and the existing utility lines, just saying 100% leaves you no margin for error whatsoever. I'm recommending 150. Again, that's subject to some debate. The shadow flicker has already been addressed. As I pointed out to Mr. Preston, you know, the idea that you have a 30-hour limit or a 30-minute-a-day limit creates a very difficult enforcement problem for you folks here. Because now you're going to require your citizens to stand outside with video cameras and stopwatches. And so I think it's easiest to enforce, and it's the best thing for your residents to just say, no shadow flicker on a non-participating property. If you sign up for the project and you're willing to deal with the consequences of that in exchange for compensation, by all means, have at it. But you can't foist it upon your neighbor. And I would recommend that you follow through with that. And the shadow detection systems that are referenced in here, again, those have been around since at least 2011. They're out there. There obviously would be some cost to the developer to include this, but your concern is not their profitability, but rather the health, safety, and welfare of your residents. Moving along into E on decommissioning, just a little minor word choice preference there for me to clarify that it should be a professional engineer acceptable to the county, not just some professional engineer that the developer may choose. Moving on into the decommissioning plan in 6B. Again, I would want that to be verified by a professional engineer that's acceptable to the county. And I would say 125 is probably a little low. It's not, again, leaving much room for error. Other townships and municipalities that I've dealt with have typically adopted a bond that would be 150% of the estimated cost. Some of that may be tempered by the fact that you guys are doing annual or biannual reviews. I don't recall what the language was. So that may not be as critical as in some other places where they're not going back and revisiting this as regularly as you folks are. And then you'll see I've added another paragraph G at the bottom. And basically what that says is in the event the financial resources for decommissioning prove to be insufficient, the owner of the property where the WEX is located shall be responsible for any deficiency in that cost. The owner of that property is going to receive payments of $8,000 to $10,000 to $12,000 per year per turbine. They're going to benefit significantly. If in the end something happens that's unforeseeable and the bond is insufficient, the bonding company goes under, whatever it may be, the rest of the residents shouldn't be forced to pay that cost. They didn't make that income for the last 20 or 30 years. That cost should be foisted back upon the landowner who hosted that turbine to begin with. And it's just a little extra insurance policy that makes sure in the end, this project doesn't end up costing your citizens far more than what they ever benefit from it. Moving along, there's one thing that I noticed tonight as we were sitting here, because I've had, frankly, ample time tonight before we got to this part, that I didn't catch in my red line, is on safety measures. It would be G6. And if you look at that sentence, all it requires is that they show you if there's going to be a problem with signal interference. It doesn't require that they preclude them from creating that problem, and it doesn't require that they take any action to correct it. All they've got to do is show you the report and say, yeah, it's going to create all kinds of problems. Here it is. Thanks. So that needs to be corrected. I'm sure that was an unintentional oversight, but that's something that I would really encourage you to correct. The language is pretty good, though, because what I've seen in a lot of places is they will use a misnomer and say, well, you can't create electromagnetic interference. And that's a game, because there is no electromagnetic interference from a turbine. The studies that I've read, what happens is the blades literally chop up the signal as it's going through. So it's not an electromagnetic interference issue, and most places have language in there that is really irrelevant. So this language overall, it's good in attempting to address the problem, but we've got to have that next step. What happens if they show you the report and it says, yeah, no one in the township's gonna have radio or TV anymore, sorry. You need to have some way to address that. And then the last thing would be, on additional considerations, H2A, talking about lighting. And that's where we spoke earlier about the on-demand lighting system. It's radar activated. There are at least 2 companies out there that are advertising that they're FAA approved, that they can provide this, and it greatly reduces the annoyance factor. I don't know how many of you have driven around over in the Thumb area at night. It's a red light district. As far as the eye can see, it's blinking red lights all night long, every single night. That type of light pollution is something that I never really considered until I was actually in the middle of it. And I've heard, and I believe you, Sarah, mentioned earlier, that it is a source of significant frustration that people talk about that impacts them, greatly. So this is something that you can do to make sure that your citizens are minimally impacted, that those lights are not on all night, every night. They only come on when they're, necessary for safety of an aircraft in the region. That's the gist of the changes that I have to make. Mr. Preston has adopted several of them. There's still some in here that I think would help strengthen your ordinance and help protect your residents, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have, although I see it's very late and you may just want me to shut up and sit down, so. Anything, anyone?
Thank you for your input.
I think Mr. Edmeyer has a question.
Does a landowner that has turbines on their property required to have a special insurance?
They're not required by your ordinance. I would advise that they probably should, because in the event of a problem, they most certainly could be held responsible as the party who hosts it. They could have some premises liability issues.
What brought that up was your comment about property owner being responsible for any decommissioning costs.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if they're required to have insurance, would that apply to this particular situation?
I doubt it, because typically those insurance policies are going to be based upon the happening of an occurrence, some incident that causes injury or something of that nature. Someone's breach of contract is typically not an insurable device, because typically insurance companies are going to say, no, you'll just go ahead and breach, so I'm not going to insure you against not breaching the contract. So they could take out an additional surety bond if those landowners wanted to make sure that they are covered and don't have any additional problems. So there are things that they could do to mitigate any potential costs to them. And I'll freely admit that it's probably highly unlikely that you would have a failure of a surety bond or something of that nature if you're dealing with a local bonding company. But as we heard tonight, somebody gets some foreign bond company, whether it's out of state or out of country, and now all of a sudden it's not worth the paper it's printed on. And so that type of provision would provide the county and its residents some additional protections. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Robert Keller, Duval Township. I'd like to support Mr. Nolan's position that you go for a 400% setback. I think that that would help address a lot of the concerns that people here have. Are you going to be able to comply with 45 dBA at 1,500 foot setback? Are those really compatible? Are you going to build them and then measure the sound and say, hey, we've got a problem? So I'm 100% in favor, and I think that the trend has shown, as this gentleman mentioned, in Europe where these things have been around a longer time, and also in the United States is happening. MSU had recommended, 2,000 foot setback. The ones in the Thumb are doing the same thing. So it's happening in Rush County, Indiana, all over. So I really hope you seriously consider a bigger setback. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
1 minute, and it has nothing to do with, if you look at the bottom, I had some numbers, 11, 12, 13, 14, those deal with decommissioning, and that is what we were talking about. We had estimates a year ago of $250,000 to $500,000 to decommission one turbine if we had the whole 19 in our township dismantled or taken down, depending on how they decommissioned them, how they took them down. However, at an April 2016 meeting, a representative from NextEra was specifically asked, how much will it cost to decommission? And they said, we had the estimate, $250,000 to $500,000. They said, $50,000 will take care of everything. And I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version. $50,000 takes care of everything. 6 feet of concrete and so forth. Then in November, at the high school, when there weren't just 150 people, there were more like 200 people there at the next meeting in November. They said $66,700. They went from $50,000 to $66,700. If you do the math, that's like 1/3. To me, that was an offer. That wasn't really an estimate because they realized they were losing support. Then at the next month, because they were asked, well, how much does it cost? What if we just want to take one down, which means they have to bring a crane in or whatever, if that's what needs to be done. And their estimate was $675,000. Those were their words. So if we had agreed the previous April to $50,000, and now we find out, well, we just want to take down one, that's $675,000, where do we come up with the other $625,000? So make sure it's in the ordinance, whatever you have. Thank you. That's it.
Madam Chair, Rick Zellman, Township. Mr. Preston, you had said something earlier that kind of caught my ear, something to the effect of an acceptable limit, the number of turbines. Is that something you can address? How many you're going to have? And another thing I want to ask any of the planners, anybody done in the Carroll area, from late afternoon into evening, and actually experienced them? It's kind of an eye-opening experience, if you will. And the third thing, 400%, that's pretty solid. I can see where we come along ways, but that 400% I think is, if you're talking 300, 500 is too much, 400 seems to be a good medium place. So I support Mr. Nolan's recommendation there as well.
And as far as his first question, I'm not sure your reference to what I said.
Well, you were saying something about if there's 600 feet, then, you know, maybe there would be less turbines and more acceptable limits. And if you do go to the Carroll area, you stand in the spot, you can see 60 to 70 turbines pretty easy.
Yeah, I was just referring to the number and this being an option for the planning commission to raise.
Right, but I just was saying, is this something you should look at? This is countywide, so how many turbines do you want?
But that's the reason.
When you see them up there, you'll understand more.
I think, okay, let's move on to the next one, otherwise we're not supposed to be here till midnight.
Well, we have a motion and a support to move this on to the townships, is that correct?
That was what was initially.
Can I ask one question? How many townships are here in
Are you talking about township
Just townships.
government or
No,
representation?
just townships, because if we send this to townships, you have to be willing to go to your township meeting and voice your opinion.
When will it be there?
If the vote passes tonight, if we can vote on it and move it to the townships, it will be sent out by staff immediately.
Chairman, question. I've been a township trustee of Ada since 2008, and we have never received any information concerning this. The only time I've heard about it was this spring when our supervisor brought it up.
We send it out to all townships every single time something comes up, all language, not just wind energy, but every time we have a proposed language change. And almost every month, our rewrite committee, our ordinance revision committee meets, and we will look at and streamline and address the entire ordinance. And we've actually went through the whole entire ordinance since 2008. And we've changed it to make it more, how can I say it, more streamlined, got rid of a lot of language, much like Mr. Nolan has suggested in this particular ordinance. So you would have to talk to your township supervisor and, you know, find out what the mail process is.
Actually, there's a better suggestion might be if any township doesn't receive a copy, then you need to be talking to your commissioner of that's responsible for those townships. I have 4 townships in part of Owasso. if any of you don't get it, then you ought to call me, because I'll make sure you get it. I wouldn't just
And it's
let it
also,
go. So contact your commissioner that's responsible for that district, and they'll be sure to get it to you.
and the minutes are also posted on the Shiawassee.net website. Yes.
How long will the townships have to respond? Are you gonna put that in the correspondence?
60 days.
60 days, so 2 months from when you send it out.
Comments now. I was a trustee also of Fair Township, and this first thing through the recommendation of our planning commission. And so some of the stuff we didn't see also. So, because we didn't understand it, because they were the recommending body. And now sitting here, and also being on the planning township planning commission, I can see what's going on.
Okay, we have a motion and support on the table to move this to the townships.
Does the staff plan on making any revisions to what we have here?
Not unless you tell me to.
So if the townships come back and say they need revisions,
Then we address it at that time.
Ma'am, I mean, can I speak? Okay, I'm from Owasso Township, and I think, the things that should be changed in the ordinance that Mr. Nolan said, I think those should be ratified and straightened around before they're sent to the townships.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you don't send it out with a 300 foot, you send it out with 400 foot. You don't send it out with maybe a 500 foot, nothing higher than 500 feet. You say, we can't, nobody else does this, why do you have to do what everybody else does? Take a stand and put 40 decibels and 45 decibels. Don't waver. This is the way it's gotta be.
Yes, sir.
A suggestion, why don't you send out both, yours and then his, and so we got both copies of his suggestions and what you do. Now we got them both sitting right there in front of us.
Well, I don't even know what to say that, but, you know, the planning commission right now can make any changes to the document. We are simply staff. We'd like to correct, we will not be sending anything to Owasso or Caledonia Township, so just for anybody thinking that's going to the board, they have their own zoning. But, you know, anything you want changed tonight, and remember, this is a volley for the township. We have not scheduled a public hearing for this information, but if there's something specific in here, Mr. Bruff would like to see the 600-foot stricken. Somebody wants to put the 400% in there. Somebody wants to see the decommissioning changed to 150, as Mr. Nolan suggested. We can do that now?
Yeah.
Or we can do it after the townships get a look at it. So it's entirely up to you folks right now, because we are at the stage, we have not officially scheduled a public hearing.
And it,
So the
Just
township
to-
should put in input after we send this, if they want
Yes.
to change. Yes.
And this would be the time for the townships to come back with their changes, so we don't reiterate and change this ordinance
We're gonna have a roll
repeatedly.
call vote.
and I don't have any problem with the townships giving input, of course. I mean, that's my suggestion, I'm just one person. Actually, my preference would be that the townships had input, and if it matches mine, great. If it doesn't, great. I think the point is that we want the townships to have input into this now, not just the planning commission. So everybody's gonna have the opportunity to put their input in, and at that time, you know, if you don't like 600 feet, put 500, 450, whatever your recommendation is, comes back to planning commission, and we hash it out and end up voting or not voting on it, or passing or not passing.
I think the best answer
Unfortunately,
is
a
all that's
lot
going
of
on.
townships that haven't been involved in this whole process. So they're not gonna have very educated, I mean, the people here have been here religiously, almost. You know, we've been working our tails off, giving up lots of time and doing lots of research on their own, and then you're gonna send it out to people that really have no idea. They may think 600 feet's good, or 300's good, or 200's good. You know,
I do
there's a
believe
lot
that-
of people that have not been to any of these.
Right, but several township officials have contacted us as far as Burns, Antrim, Woodhull has been represented here a number of times, and do talk about, and they call us up and said, where's the stuff on the website? They are monitoring this, and they are aware of the situation, so, yeah. It's up to the planning commission at this point.
Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Nolan made this statement that we're here to serve the people. We have a group of people here tonight who've come to the meeting to express their opinion. I have the idea that they favor Mr. Nolan's proposal more than they do the planning commission proposal so far. Is that true?
That's true. That's true.
Okay. So I'd like to make a proposal that we accept Mr. Nolan's paper and send that out to our township.
We have a motion on the table at this point in time that we have not yet voted on. And we need to move forward on this.
Okay, hold it down.
Well, my plan is right now, if we start here, get the townships' opinions, make people come out to those townships so they can hear and do the thing we do in democracies is to go to meetings and make sure that everything gets heard, and then bring that back to us with all that information so we can make proper changes.
And in all fairness, we have adopted many of Mr. Nolan's suggestions over the months. Is that not a fair assumption?
Sure, yeah, Mr. Preston and I have
Okay,
spoken over the last couple of weeks.
so at
on
this
several
point in time, it is time to move this forward based on the schedule that we came up with months ago. So the townships, it's your turn to look at this and get your revisions back to us so that we can address this again. Roll call vote? Okay.
Mr. Brook?
Yes.
Mr. Foster?
No?
Mr. Edmeyer?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Saxton? Mr. Andrews?
Yes.
Mrs. Ott?
Yes.
Motion is passed. To send on the contracts.
Thank you.
So I'd anticipate that we'll probably be able to get this out at the beginning of the week. We will, any typos or anything, we will have it posted on the website and